Hello, everyone. I am the Cursed Speaker. I help you relax and fall asleep with stories and spoken words. Before we begin, like this video, subscribe, and tell me in the comments, what time is it where you are, and where are you watching from? Now, just listen and unwind. I found a strange town in the middle of nowhere. Something terrible happened there. So imagine this. Evan and Mariah, a couple straight out of one of those glossy travel magazines. Except, more real, less airbrushed. Evan's got this wild look in his eyes, always chasing after the next big story for his blog. He's the kind of guy who thinks a good adventure beats a five-star hotel any day. Mariah, on the other hand, she's his anchor. Keeps him from floating away into the clouds of his wild ideas. She loves a good adventure too, but prefers to know she'll make it back in one piece. Now, these two lovebirds were on a road trip, the kind where you just drive with no real destination in mind, letting the road take you where it will. That's when Evan starts telling Mariah about this town. Not just any town, but a town that, according to some dusty old forums and a couple of too curious for their own good bloggers, had just vanished off the map. Like poof, gone. No one seemed to know what happened to it, or why it just dropped off the face of the earth. Mariah rolled her eyes. "Sounds like a load of crap," she said, but Evan, he was hooked. He had that look in his eye, the one that said he wouldn't rest until he'd seen it for himself. And you can bet he managed to find it somehow, among forgotten roads and trails that looked like they hadn't seen a car in decades. They stumbled upon it. The town, if you could still call it that, was eerie. Picture this, buildings and cars covered in so much dust it looked like a scene from one of those apocalypse movies. The kind of silence that's so heavy it presses down on you, makes your ears ring. Not a soul in sight. It was like the town had just stopped, frozen in time. Evan was practically bouncing in his seat. "This is it, can you believe it?" he kept saying, his voice a mix of excitement and something else. Something like disbelief, maybe. Mariah, she wasn't so sure. This place gave her the creeps. She had a bad feeling, the kind that sits in the pit of your stomach and just won't go away. But Evan, he was already out of the car, camera in hand, ready to document every nook and cranny of this ghost town. "Come on, Mariah, this is blog gold," he called over his shoulder, not even noticing the way the silence seemed to swallow his words whole. Mariah followed, albeit reluctantly. She couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, though every time she looked over her shoulder, all she saw were empty streets and the shadows of buildings that seemed to lean in a little too close. They wandered the town, Evan snapping pictures and going on about how this was going to be the story that made his blog blow up. Mariah couldn't help but notice the little things that seemed off. Like how some of the cars were parked in the middle of the street, as if they'd been abandoned in a hurry. Or the way some of the doors to the houses were left wide open. The insides dark and unwelcoming. It was when they reached the town square that things really started to feel wrong. The square was dominated by an old clock tower, its hands frozen at 3:07. Surrounding it were benches and a fountain dried up and filled with leaves. But it was the statues that caught Mariah's attention. They were odd. Not the kind of statues you'd expect in a town square. These were too lifelike, expressions of fear and horror etched into their faces so perfectly, it sent a shiver down Mariah's spine. "Evan," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "this place is freaking me out. Let's go." But Evan wasn't listening. He was too caught up in his own world talking about how this was going to be his big break. "Just a little longer," he kept saying. That's when the whispers started, soft at first, so faint Mariah thought she was imagining them. But then they grew louder, a cacophony of voices that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at the same time. She spun around trying to find the source, but there was nothing, just the empty, dust-covered town. "Evan, please," she begged, her voice tinged with panic now. "We need to leave, now." That's when Evan finally looked at her, really looked at her, and saw the fear in her eyes. Okay, he said, putting his arm around her. "Let's head back to the car." They walked back the way they came, the whispers following them, always just out of sight. It felt like the town was closing in on them, the buildings leaning in, the shadows stretching out like fingers trying to grab hold. When they finally made it back to the car, Mariah thought she was going to collapse with relief. But as Evan tried to start the engine, nothing happened. He tried again and again, but the car just wouldn't start. That's when they heard it, a low, guttural growl that seemed to come from the shadows themselves. Mariah's heart was pounding so hard she thought it might burst out of her chest. Evan looked at her, his eyes wide with fear. "What was that?" he whispered. "I don't know," Mariah whispered back, "and I don't want to find out." They were trapped. The car wouldn't start. The town seemed to be alive with shadows and whispers, and whatever was out there in the dark was getting closer. So, there they were, in a forgotten town that wasn't supposed to exist, surrounded by something they couldn't see, but could definitely feel. It was the kind of situation you never think you'll find yourself in, the kind you only hear about in stories. And let me tell you, the horror they felt in that moment, it was as real as it gets. So Evan and Mariah, these two were always on the lookout for the next big adventure, right? They'd heard about this abandoned town through an obscure online forum, and Evan, being the thrill seeker, convinced Mariah it was the perfect spot for their weekend getaway. "Think of the photos, the history, the mystery," he'd said, his eyes sparkling with the excitement of a kid on Christmas morning. Mariah, less enthusiastic but always up for supporting Evan's wild ideas, agreed. They packed their bags, not knowing they were about to step into a story they'd never forget, the kind that sticks to your bones like cold winter air. The drive was long, the road winding through forests that seemed to whisper secrets. As they entered the town, the first thing that hit them was the silence. It was the kind of quiet that felt almost heavy, like it was muffling more than just sound. Evan was practically bouncing in his seat, pointing out the faded signs and overgrown paths. But Mariah couldn't shake off a feeling of unease. Walking down the main street, they noticed something odd, fresh footprints. It hadn't rained for days, yet here were these clear, unmistakable marks in the dust, leading off into the distance. "Cool, right?" Evan said, his voice a mix of awe and excitement. "It's like we're not the only ones exploring this place." Mariah wasn't convinced. "But there's no one around. Where do they come from? Where do they go?" she muttered, her eyes scanning the empty windows and doorways, half expecting an answer to appear. As they ventured further, the oddities didn't stop. They decided to take a break in what looked like an old cafe. The air inside was stale, and a layer of dust covered everything like a blanket. They found a relatively clean table and set down their backpacks. Evan was rummaging through his bag for his camera when Mariah, who was staring absent-mindedly at a cup on the table, gasped. The cup, previously still, started sliding slowly towards the edge of the table before stopping abruptly. "No way!" Evan exclaimed, having caught the tail end of the movement. "Did you see that? Please tell me you got that on camera." Mariah, however, wasn't amused. "Things don't just move on their own, Evan. This is weird. I don't like it." But Evan was already typing away on his phone, probably updating his blog or bragging to his friends about their haunted find. "Come on, Mariah. It's probably just the wind or something. This is gold." They continued their exploration, but Mariah couldn't shake off the feeling of being watched. It was as if the town itself had eyes, and they were all fixed on her and Evan. As night began to fall, they decided to set up camp in the middle of the main street. The silence of the day gave way to an even more oppressive stillness. It was then that the whispers started. Soft at first, so much so that Evan thought Mariah was trying to mess with him. "Very funny, Mariah, I know that's you." But the look on her face told him she heard them too. The whispers grew louder, a cacophony of voices that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at the same time. They couldn't make out what was being said, but the tone was unmistakable. It wasn't welcoming. Evan tried to laugh it off. "Guess we're not alone after all. This is awesome. Can you imagine the stories we'll have after this?" Mariah was far from thrilled. "This isn't right, Evan. We need to leave, now." But Evan was like a dog with a bone, his curiosity overriding his common sense. "No way. This is the kind of stuff you don't run from. This is what we came for." The night dragged on, the whispers never ceasing. Objects seemed to move of their own accord, a chair scraping against the floor here, a door slowly creaking shut there. It was as if the town was alive, and it was making it abundantly clear they were intruders. Evan, ever the optimist, was thrilled. He took to his blog, typing furiously about their experiences, convinced they were making history. Mariah, on the other hand, was convinced they were making a huge mistake. She couldn't shake the feeling of dread that had settled in her stomach, a constant reminder that they were not welcome. As dawn broke, the whispers faded, and the town seemed to settle back into its silent vigil. Evan was buzzing with energy, eager to explore more, but Mariah was firm. "We're leaving, Evan. I don't care what you say. This place, it's wrong. Can't you feel it?" Evan, seeing the genuine fear in Mariah's eyes, finally relented. As they packed up their camp, the town seemed to watch them go, the oppressive feeling of being watched slowly fading as they made their way back to the car. The drive back was silent, both of them processing the night's events in their own way. Evan was already planning their next adventure, but Mariah couldn't help but feel relieved as the town disappeared in the rearview mirror, a chilling reminder that some mysteries are better left unsolved. So, Evan and Mariah, right? They were these two friends, thick as thieves, always up for an adventure. They had this quirky hobby of exploring abandoned places. You know, the kind that gives you the creeps just thinking about them. But this time, their curiosity led them to something way out of their league. It all started when they decided to check out the old town hall in their sleepy little town. The place had been deserted for years, rumors of it being haunted, floating around like the morning fog. But Evan and Mariah, they didn't buy into that stuff. They were there for the thrill, the history, maybe even a bit of danger. But what they found was something else entirely. As they wandered through the dusty, forgotten halls, Evan stumbled upon a loose floorboard. Curiosity piqued. They pried it open, revealing a narrow staircase spiraling down into darkness. Mariah hesitated, but Evan, with that wild spark in his eyes, was all in. They descended, the air growing colder, the silence heavier. At the bottom, they found themselves in an underground chamber, the walls lined with shelves filled with relics that screamed dark rituals. There were symbols etched into the stone that neither of them recognized, but the vibe was unmistakable. This place was used for something sinister. And the worst part? There were signs of recent use, a candle still warm, a fresh drop of wax on the floor. Evan's initial excitement morphed into horror as the realization hit them. Mariah, ever the voice of reason, insisted they contact the authorities. This was way beyond them, she argued. But as they tried to retrace their steps, something strange happened. The staircase they had come down was gone, replaced by a solid stone wall. No matter how hard they searched, they couldn't find a way out. It was as if the chamber was reshaping itself, trapping them inside. Panic set in. They shouted for help, but their voices were swallowed by the thick, oppressive air of the chamber. That's when they noticed the figures. Cloaked in shadow, they stood at the edge of their vision, watching silently. Every attempt to approach them or communicate ended in disorientation and blackouts. Evan and Mariah would find themselves back in the center of the chamber, with no memory of how they got there. Time started to play tricks on them. Hours felt like days, and sometimes minutes stretched into what seemed like hours. They were caught in a loop, a nightmare they couldn't wake up from. The figures in the shadows seemed to be controlling everything, the masters of this twisted domain. Evan, trying to keep it together, suggested they split up, thinking they might find another way out if they searched separately. Mariah was reluctant, the idea of being alone in this place terrifying her, but she saw no other choice. They agreed to meet back in the chamber in what they hoped would be an hour. Mariah's search was fruitless, the corridors and rooms shifting and changing like a maze designed to confuse and disorient. When she returned to the chamber, Evan was nowhere to be seen. She called out for him, her voice echoing off the stone walls, but there was no reply. The figures in the shadows seemed to close in, their presence more menacing than before. Hours passed. or at least Mariah thought they did. Time had lost all meaning. She was about to give up hope when Evan staggered into the chamber, his face pale, his eyes wide with terror. He collapsed, gasping for breath, and when he finally managed to speak, his words sent chills down Mariah's spine. He had found a room, he said, a room filled with photographs of the town's residents, all of them marked with those same sinister symbols they had seen on the walls. But that wasn't the worst part. Among the photos were pictures of them, Evan and Mariah, taken long before they had decided to explore the town hall. It was as if their fate had been sealed from the start. They realized then that they were dealing with something beyond their understanding, a malevolent force that had ensnared them. The figures in the shadows were not just observers. They were participants in whatever dark ritual this place was used for. Evan and Mariah were the latest in a long line of victims, chosen for reasons they couldn't comprehend. Desperation took hold, driving them to search for an escape with renewed fervor. They tried everything, retracing their steps, searching for hidden passages, even attempting to break through the walls. But it was futile. The chamber and its adjoining corridors were their prison, and the figures in the shadows their wardens. As they slumped to the floor, exhausted and defeated, the figures approached, their forms becoming clearer. They were not human, not entirely. Their features were twisted, their eyes glowing with an unnatural light. They spoke in a language that Evan and Mariah couldn't understand, but the intent was clear. They were not going to let them leave. In a final act of defiance, Mariah pulled out her phone, hoping to capture evidence of their captors to leave some trace of what had happened to them. But as she pointed the camera at the figures, they vanished, leaving behind a chilling message etched into the stone floor. Some doors should never be opened. Evan and Mariah were never seen again. The town hall remained abandoned, its secrets buried deep within. Some say the chamber is still there, hidden away, waiting for the next curious soul to stumble upon it. But those who know the story of Evan and Mariah, they stay away, heeding the warning left behind. So next time you're thinking about exploring that creepy old building on the edge of town, remember this story. Some things are better left undiscovered. So there we were, standing in the middle of the town square, the kind of place you'd expect to see in a postcard or one of those old-timey movies. Not the setting for your worst nightmare. But as the saying goes, looks can be deceiving, right? The cobblestone beneath our feet felt cold, colder than it should have been, considering it was a balmy summer night. The moon hung low, a sliver of silver against the inky black sky, casting just enough light to make out the shapes moving towards us. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. You know how it is when you're scared, everything seems to move in the shadows. But this was different. These weren't just shadows, they were shadowy figures gliding towards us with a purpose that sent shivers down my spine. Guys, do you see that? I whispered, my voice barely a breath. Yeah, Alex replied, his voice tight with fear. I see them. We backed up until we were standing back to back, trying to keep an eye on every direction. The figures seemed to be closing in from all sides, their movements silent but determined. It was like they were part of the night itself, blending in until they were right upon you. What do they want? Sarah's voice quivered as she spoke, her usual bravado nowhere to be found. I don't know, I admitted, but I don't think we should stick around to find out. Easier said than done. Every time we tried to move, to find a gap between them, they shifted, blocking our path. It was like they were hurting us, but to what end? That's when the chanting started. Low and monotonous, it seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, creeping under our skin. The figures raised their arms towards the sky, and the air around us began to thicken, almost like you could reach out and touch it. Is that Latin? Alex muttered, trying to make sense of the sound swirling around us. Who cares what it is? How do we get out of this? Sarah snapped, panic edging into her voice. I racked my brain, trying to remember anything that could help us, any lore or legend that mentioned shadowy figures in chanting, but my mind was blank, paralyzed by fear. And then, as if the situation wasn't dire enough, the ground beneath us started to glow. Faint lines of light tracing patterns and symbols I'd never seen before. They interconnected, forming a circle around us, binding us to the spot. We're in the middle of some kind of ritual, I realized, the words tasting like ash in my mouth. A ritual for what? Alex asked. But I think deep down, we all knew we wouldn't like the answer. The chanting grew louder, more insistent, and the figures converged on the edge of the glowing circle, their forms becoming more distinct. They were people, or at least they had been once. Their eyes were hollow, their expressions twisted in eternal agony. And that's when it hit me, the revelation that turned my blood to ice. This town, with its picturesque charm and welcoming smiles, was a facade. It fed on fear, luring curious souls like us to sustain its existence. These figures, they were the previous victims, lost to time, their essence bound to the town, forced to repeat this ritual over and over. "We're next," I whispered, the horror of our situation sinking in. "They're going to bind us here, make us part of the town." "No, no, no," Sarah repeated, her voice a mantra of denial. "There has to be a way out." But as we searched desperately for an escape, the realization dawned on us that there was none. We were cornered, trapped in a nightmare of our own making. Our curiosity had led us here, to the heart of darkness. The figures began to move closer, the circle of light tightening around us. The air was charged with energy, the kind that makes your hair stand on end and your skin crawl. We were at the mercy of the town and its inhabitants, both living and not. In a last-ditch effort, Alex lunged at the barrier of light, only to be thrown back as if he'd hit a wall. He crumpled to the ground, dazed but thankfully not seriously hurt. "We have to break the circle," Sarah said, a spark of determination in her eyes. "It's the source of their power." But how? We had no tools, no knowledge of how to disrupt whatever ancient magic was at work here. And then, as if the town itself was mocking us, the answer came in the form of a downpour. Rain began to fall, heavy and relentless, the kind of summer storm that comes out of nowhere. "Water," I said, a glimmer of hope breaking through the despair. "Water can disrupt the flow of energy. We need to redirect the rain into the circle." It was a long shot, but it was all we had. Using our jackets, we worked together to create a makeshift channel, diverting the flow of water towards the glowing lines on the ground. The figures seemed to sense our plan, their chants growing more frantic, more desperate. And then, with a sound like 1,000 whispers being snuffed out at once, the circle broke. The light flickered and died, the rain washing away the last traces of the symbols that had bound us. The figures screamed, a sound of rage and anguish that I'll never forget, before they dissolved into the night, leaving us alone in the town square, soaked to the bone, but alive. We didn't wait around to see if they would return. Grabbing our things, we ran as fast as our legs would carry us, not stopping until we were far away from that cursed town. As we caught our breath, the reality of what had happened began to sink in. We had escaped, but at what cost? How many before us hadn't been so lucky? And how many after us would wander into the town, unaware of the horror that awaited them? "We have to tell someone," Sarah said, determination in her voice. "But who would believe us? A tale of shadowy figures, ancient rituals, and a town that fed on fear." It sounded like something out of a horror movie, not real life. Yet as we made our way back to the safety of the familiar, the truth of our experience weighed heavily on us. We had glimpsed the darkness that lurks beneath the surface of the world, hidden in plain sight. And we had survived. But the town, with its cobblestone streets and charming facades, would continue to exist, waiting for the next curious souls to stumble upon its secret. And the shadowy figures, the lost victims of a never-ending cycle of fear, would be there to greet them, just as they had greeted us. So let this be a warning to you, my friends. Be careful where your curiosity leads you, for some secrets are better left undiscovered. And some towns are better left alone. So there we were, Mariah and Evan, in the heart of this God-forsaken town that seemed to have been plucked straight out of a nightmare. The air was thick, almost like you could slice it with a knife, and every step we took echoed off the crumbling walls of the abandoned buildings, making us jump at our own shadows. The sky was a blanket of gray, suffocating any hope of sunlight piercing through. It was the kind of place you'd expect to find in a horror movie, not in real life. Evan had this crazy obsession with exploring forgotten places, documenting his adventures on his blog. It was his idea to come here, convinced there was a story worth telling hidden beneath the layers of dust and decay. Mariah, well, she was the kind of friend who'd follow you into hell just to make sure you had company. She had her reservations, sure, but Evan's enthusiasm was infectious. As they ventured deeper into the town, the feeling of unease grew. It wasn't just the silence or the desolation. It was the whispers. Faint at first, so much so that you'd think your mind was playing tricks on you. But as they moved on, the whispers grew louder, more insistent. They seemed to be coming from everywhere and nowhere, a cacophony of voices that didn't belong to the living. "Did you hear that?" Mariah's voice was barely above a whisper, her eyes wide with fear. Evan, ever the skeptic, shrugged it off. "It's just the wind, Mariah. These old buildings, they make sounds. It's nothing." But it wasn't nothing. They both knew it. The air grew colder, the whispers more frantic. It was as if the very soul of the town was crying out, trapped in an endless loop of despair. That's when they saw it. The source of the whispers. A figure shrouded in shadows, standing in the middle of the street. It was impossible to tell if it was male or female, its features obscured by the darkness. But the malice in its stance, the way it seemed to be looking right at them, sent shivers down their spines. "We need to leave, now," Evan said, the fear evident in his voice for the first time. They turned to run, but the town had other plans. The streets twisted and turned, leading them in circles. Buildings that were once behind them now stood in their path, their doors opening and closing with a mind of their own. The whispers grew louder, angrier, until they were a deafening roar in their ears. It was clear they weren't alone. Shadows darted between the buildings, watching, waiting. The figure appeared and disappeared, always just out of reach, leading them further into the maze. Exhausted, scared, and with no way out, Evan made a decision. "Listen, Mariah, I have an idea, but you're not going to like it." "What? Anything, just get us out of here," she pleaded. "I'm going to lead it away. You run in the opposite direction. Find a way out." "No, I'm not leaving you here," Mariah protested, tears streaming down her face. "It's the only way. You know it is. I'll be fine. I promise." But they both knew it was a promise he couldn't keep. With a final desperate look, Evan ran towards the figure, shouting and waving his arms. The shadows converged on him, the whispers reaching a fever pitch. Mariah ran. She ran as fast as her legs could carry her, tears blurring her vision. She didn't look back, couldn't bear to see what was happening to Evan. The town seemed to relent, the buildings stepping aside, the whispers fading into the distance. And then, just like that, she was out. The gray skies gave way to blue. The oppressive air lifted. She collapsed on the ground, gasping for breath, her body shaking with sobs. Mariah made it back to civilization, but she was forever changed. The whispers didn't leave her, not really. They followed her in her dreams, a constant reminder of the price paid for their escape. Weeks turned into months, and Evan's fate remained a mystery. The police search turned up nothing, no sign of him or the hellish town they had stumbled upon. It was as if they had never existed. But Mariah knew better. She held on to the hope that somewhere, somehow, Evan was still out there. Until one day, she stumbled upon something that chilled her to the bone. Evan's blog had been updated. It was a post about their trip to the abandoned town, detailed and vivid, as if he had written it himself. But the ending, it was all wrong. It spoke of a peaceful town, welcoming and warm, urging readers to visit, to hear the whispers for themselves. The comments section was filled with curious adventurers, eager to explore this hidden gem. Mariah tried to warn them, to tell them the truth, but her comments were deleted, her messages ignored. The story ends with another unwitting traveler, camera in hand, standing at the edge of the town. They had read Evan's last blog post. intrigued by the mystery of the place. As they step into the heart of the town, the whispers begin, just as they had for Mariah and Evan, and somewhere in the shadows a figure watches, waiting to claim its next victim.